Hey, I'm Dr. Mark Kovacs, excited to be presenting tennis movement and footwork using a common language. So I want to get started by just sort of describing the concepts behind tennis movement and footwork. I think everyone that's watching has played tennis most of their life, has coached tennis most of their life, and understands the big picture, the macro aspects of what we're trying to accomplish when we are teaching or evaluating tennis movement and footwork. But the reason this presentation I think will be helpful is in my 20 plus years of doing this, working with thousands of coaches, the one big challenge we've always had between communicating between the physical training staff, the medical department, the physical therapists, the tennis coaches, the parents, and the players is using a consistent language around tennis movement and footwork. Everyone, when they say a forehand or a semi-western forehand or a two-handed backhand, they know what we're talking about. But when we say a recovery step or a drop step or a jab step or a pivot step, not everyone uses the same terms for that. So hopefully today we'll be able to walk through that in some pretty good detail, give you some resources that can help make sure that everyone's using consistent language around tennis movement and footwork. So where this project started was I was involved in an elite coaching course we were doing to about 30 of the best coaches in the world. Everyone in the room had worked with Grand Slam winners, Olympians, top 10 in the world ITF juniors. So it was the best of the best from a coaching standpoint. They'd been around the best players for most of their career, and they were very experienced. The youngest coach in the room was 36 years old. The oldest was 74. So they had significant amount of years in what they were doing. So as we were going through a bunch of different footwork patterns, the discussion was about certain, who moves best to the wide ball, who moves best to the deep ball. And you're seeing, Nadal hit forehands, you're seeing Serena hit backhands, you're seeing different people move on the court. And you hear these coaches, all from all over the world, use different terms to describe the exact same movement. And we had known that. I'd worked in federations for many years with multiple different coaches from different backgrounds, and they'd all use slightly different terms to describe the same movements. But it was really the aha moment at that point that, unfortunately, we don't have consistent language. So, about 4 years ago or so, worked with the International Tennis Performance Association, and we got a group together to sort of evaluate. We spent probably over 100 hours evaluating the top movers in the world and what were the most consistent footwork patterns that they would do, trying to avoid style, focusing on the fundamentals. And we had over about 100 movements that came out of that. And we know that 100 movements is too many for most people to remember, to learn, to comprehend. So we sort of narrowed it down to the ones that showed up at least 5 to 10 times in a match. So these are the movements that we see consistently across male and female players, and putting it into a little over 30 movements that every tennis coach, every physical trainer that works with tennis should know, should understand, and should be aware of. So this is the resource. It's been available for ITPA members for the last few years. So it'll talk a little bit about more where we can get this, where you guys can get this. It's free. It's a free resource from the International Tennis Performance Association. My background, I've been fortunate to work with a lot of different athletes in tennis. I also work in a number of other sports. But from a tennis player perspective, you can see on the screen there, they're all athletes that have very different movement patterns, very different heights, genders, experience in training methods, things like that. But what it allowed for was to really be able to implement what are the most important fundamentals when you're training athletes, and specifically tennis players. My background outside of tennis, some folks may not be aware, worked a lot with other sports, specifically soccer, baseball, spent a lot of time, and now I spend a lot of time in basketball, working with some of the professional athletes in those sports. So it allows me to have a perspective on movement that isn't just tennis-centric. It's a lot of sports, but because of my background and interest, we've got to make movement training specific to the sport. Too many people do generic movement drills, sprinting drills, wall drills, ladder drills, things that don't necessarily translate to tennis movement. I've worked with many great athletes that look phenomenal, and then you put them on a tennis court to get them in positions and they look terrible. So you got to apply tennis-specific training, tennis-specific movements when you're working with your players on a consistent basis. So to recall what makes you fast, stride length is a big part of that. Taking big steps is faster than taking small steps. Taking small steps is probably one of the worst things you can do if you want to move quickly. Not saying you don't need adjusting steps in tennis, but if you want to move quickly, you don't want to take small steps. You need great stability at the ankle, at the knee, and at the hip to be able to transfer those forces well. Stride frequency, how quickly your turnover is. Flexibility and mobility. So flexibility in a functional range of motion is sort of how we describe it. Some people use the term mobility, which is different to flexibility. It's under force or under load, which is really what we want. And then force into the ground. How much force can you generate in the shortest amount of time? And that's what's going to really determine how quick you can be. Movements on court need to be accounted for, meaning that you have to initiate movement in certain parts of the court. You have to know how many seconds per point your player that you're working with generates on an average basis, and usually we break it into thirds. What do their short points look like? What do their medium points look like? And what do their long points look like in time? Where on the court do they run around their backhand to hit forehands a lot? Then you would need to train that athlete very different than someone that predominantly likes to hit backhand cross-court patterns and using that. So training a movement for tennis is very different based on playing style. We spend a lot of different time focused on training the athlete for their playing style, not just training generically. So going back to this tennis movement and footwork workbook that was developed, if you go to the ITPA-tennis.org website, you'll see the pop-up there. Click on that and you'll be able to download this. Again, it goes through all these movements and it provides you photos of them in the specific footwork positions, and then also some terminology around it, just so that everyone is consistent. And it really has made a huge difference for the ITPA folks that have already utilized this over the last 2 or 3 years. It allows the coach to communicate with the physical trainer using the same language, and no one has to explain anything. You just say, hey, I want to get better at the front crossover step, and they know what that is. Or I want to get better with the runaround forehand drop step, and the physical trainer goes to work, knows how to improve that. It makes the coach's job so much easier, because you don't have to show the positions. They have already studied what that is. So again, these are the terms. Some of you guys, I'm sure, use terms that are exactly the same as this and very similar. Some of these terms you may never heard before. But again, there's lateral movements, backward movements, forward movements, recovery movements after different wide and deep balls. There's what do you do after the return of serve, after you make contact, overhead, serve, and volley movements. So every component of a tennis point has a different movement capability to it. So you need to understand that. Great athletes will get there naturally, and you shouldn't have to overteach movement. Anyone that overteaches movement is usually doing the athlete a disservice. We want the drill to force them into a certain position to work on certain types of movements. We don't want to get too technical with that. However, there are positions on the court where an athlete gets into a bad habit, was never taught the right way, never naturally got there, or has some physical limitations that doesn't allow them to do certain things. And at that point, you need to correct them, you need to fix the physical limitations, and you need to put them in the right positions. And the question is, do you know what those right positions are? Hopefully we'll go through some of this and this will help. So again, go to the ITPA-tennis.org website and you can download this entire workbook that you'll see components of it as we go along here. So, technical improvements can happen quickly. Physical improvements take time. So what does that mean? Same thing with tennis strokes. You can make a technical adjustment in 10 seconds, in a minute, in 10 reps. But to physically improve an athlete, it takes time. Here's an example of an athlete really good athlete as well. At this age, just around 22 years old, 21, 22. So they've got some physical capabilities, but you can see here, they're sort of struggling with this movement. It's not as easy as it looks, this movement, but notice how hard for them to jump with explosiveness, and it's really tough for them to land with stability. And that's the obvious thing. And this is after some significant amount of training. This is months, not weeks. Notice the difference of how stable they are, even on an unstable surface using the mat. We've moved their center of mass above their head, which makes it even harder. But notice how much better this athlete is. And just want to show that to show how much time it does take to work on it when you're talking on a physical standpoint. Here's an example in a month, same athlete. So you're seeing the front crossover training. All you're working on is front crossovers. Do they have that ability? And then we see, the difference in a month. So month to month to month, the 3 photos. Notice how much better the athlete looks here from that perspective. And again, consistent training on technique, but there's also quite a lot of strength training that goes on behind this. This athlete was in a blocker training. We were in the gym 5 days a week, lifting heavy, lifting single leg work, lifting double leg work, working specifically on movements. So it's really, really important to understand that this 1 or 2 month improvement that you see here doesn't happen without a lot of work behind the scenes. It's not as easy as just do it. So for example here, here would be an example of some of the lifting that occurred in the month. So you see an improvement there from that standpoint as well, just from a weight perspective. So all these things occur with a foundation of training. So really important. But before we get to that, we also spend a lot of time on landing. So you got to really make sure your athletes know how to land before we focus too much on acceleration. So here's an example of 3 progressions that we go through. One is just dropping, landing, jumping. Can they do that? If they can do that, they go into a more explosive type movement. Single leg, if you notice on that left lower screen there, that's a tough exercise. So it's in that lunge position or rear elevated split squat, some people will call this, and then they have to jump and explode from there. And then the last one, the bottom right, is the toughest because we're going into jumping movements. And a lot of people will try to start with the jumping movements, and they can do it. They can get through the exercise, but they're going to do it in a way that isn't ideal, isn't, performed correctly, and potentially could increase risk of injury because it's a really tough exercise. So one thing you want to make sure you do is work with your athletes on learning how to land and make sure that's a component of majority of your training sessions. So larger steps versus smaller steps. When we're talking tennis, you may be asking, why am I showing you Usain Bolt, fastest person in the history of movement? So using him as an example, he takes 41 steps at his fastest to run the 100-meter sprint. Pretty much everyone else in that race takes 44 to 45 steps. So he takes 3 or 4 steps less than his competitors. That's why he's fastest. You can say, okay, he's stronger, he's got greater stride length, he's got longer legs, he's got greater fast twitch fibers. That's all true. But in the simplest way of explaining it, why is he faster than everyone else? He takes less steps in the same amount of time. Same thing happens on the tennis court. If you look at some of the best movers, they take larger steps. And the problem in tennis is we get so focused on ball contact that we spend a lot of time focused on adjusting steps, making sure the athlete adjusts effectively. You only really need adjusting steps if your long steps aren't perfect. So I'm not saying you don't want to train adjusting steps, but if you want to train someone to be fast, adjusting steps is shouldn't be the focus. So, for example here, arguably the best or one of the top few best movers of all time. I know it's on clay, but the purpose of showing this is the pivot step. So this is a very, very normal, common step that we see every tennis player will do. So that's when the outside leg, the left leg, crosses over the right leg on that first step. So the first step is you turn your right hip out, and then the left leg comes across, and then you take off to your shot. So this is a very normal situation. But what I want you to focus on is how big his steps are. I know it's on clay, but the purpose here is to show that he takes 2 steps between the tee and the single sideline. Notice that? 2 steps. 1, 2. So he takes 2 big steps to get from the tee to the single sideline. That's what we want from our athletes. However, young athletes don't have the strength, they don't have the limb length to do it, so we usually say 3 for the, higher level juniors, 4 for the lower level juniors or the younger kids. So just to give you a frame of reference of what they should be doing. If they're taking 5, 6 steps to get there, inefficient movement, and they're going to be slower. Large steps applies in all these scenarios. So again, the goal is to get from A to B as fast as you can. And this is when the ball's far away from you. Totally understand, if you got more time, you don't need these big steps because you got plenty of time. You may do shuffle steps, you may do smaller steps, but when you're trying to cover the court and be fast and take time away from your athlete and things like that, these are the types of things you got to be working on and training with a racket in your hand, as well as when you don't have the racket in your hand. So, for this example here, 2 big steps, same concept. Doing in sand in this example, the objective here is to get those big steps, working here with an athlete who's nearly 7 feet tall. So I've been fortunate to work with really the 2 tallest tennis players ever to play in, John Isner and Riley Opelka. And now I work in the NBA with a lot of other really tall athletes. And, their movement patterns are the same. They just have much longer limbs. And there's certain movements you do with them and there's certain movements you don't want to do with them because of the extra stress that it may put on the body and their knees and their back, things like that. But movement patterns are similar. They got to move around the tennis court the same as someone who's smaller. So as you can see here, this is that movement that we were working on. And then when you do your drilling on court, you'll see that same type of movement pop up. So you can kind of see here, similar type movement. Working on that deep ball, we're trying to load the outside leg, trying to get across there to make that happen. So again, the objective here really is to mimic your training to the demands of the sport and make sure that you're optimizing your time. If you're not optimizing your time, you're wasting the athlete's time, you're wasting the coach's time. You have to do everything in the gym, in the weight room, on the court, in the sand, on the track, on the field, that has a specific purpose to make your tennis athlete better. So here's a different drill, which is a shadow drill. Most of you will use a version of this. But again, notice the emphasis on steps, on getting big first step, big last step, to make sure the athlete can load the outside leg. So again, and then you go for the shadow to get comfortable, and then notice you put the ball in, and you want them to try to replicate, hopefully, as close as possible to those big step concepts. Notice how he's got time between shots. That's done on purpose, so he can shuffle back, get in set, and then go. So the objective here is to simulate about the right speed of what you may see in a point. If you do it too fast, which is what happens with a lot of people that hand feed, is it's not replicating the speed of what you may see on the court. So really important to try to replicate some of that. So from a training standpoint, if we want to train that outside leg from a movement standpoint, this is a drill we use a lot, where you sort of have that stable leg. In this example, the right leg doesn't move, it just pivots. Notice how that right hip turns. So the right hip turns, but the left leg, you open the hip, you turn the foot out, and you load the glutes and the leg. If your athletes want to hit well on that outside leg, you've got to load that hip. You've got to be in that position effectively, because that then allows you options. And that's what tennis is all about. Do you have more options than your opponent? Can you load that outside leg? Can you hit off the back leg? Can you transfer into the front leg for a close stance stroke? Can you hit high balls off that? What options do you have? And being able to be strong through here, this helps on a number of movements and positions on the tennis court. Same thing here. Trying to get a big fella to get low and push off that back leg is not easy. We all know that. But again, does a great job of utilizing that to get low, trying to get through that hip, trying to drop down, trying to be able to use that back leg. As the game gets faster, as the players you're playing get better, you have less time. This shot becomes more important. Not saying we want to hit this shot all the time, but you do have to be able to hit that shot pretty regularly off your second serve return many times. Great servers like Riley usually doesn't get a return like that, but he will get that in a rally position a lot, and you want to get low and get those hips down. So working through that from a movement standpoint makes a huge difference. Hip and shoulder movement. So from this example, we're trying to take the racket out of their hand and work on hip position. That's why the upper body we're trying to take out. You're trying to just focus on the hips. Load that outside leg, transition on the recovery step. Notice how similar this position is to the two previous videos that we were working on, trying to get deep into that hip, trying to load into that hip, trying to make sure the athlete can get in the right position and then come out of it. Really important that those things happen. So from a power perspective, we've got a couple things going on here. Notice here again, outside leg load. This whole series has been focused on an outside leg load, because if you can get your athletes to have great stability in that outside leg, it allows you to then train from that position. You can do anything from there. You can stay on that outside leg and hit full open stance. You can load up on that outside leg and hit a semi-open stance. You can load up on that leg and hit a square stance or even a closed stance. So again, it goes back to giving you options. And that's what we want. We want options when we're talking about training, high level competitive tennis players. And then the goal is to sit back in that hip. Notice how there's a slight pause. That's by design. So the goal of this drill, we call this the pause drill, because we want to pause for about half a second right there. Notice how you basically stop. What you're doing there is you're storing energy, loading, and then having to re-accelerate rather than doing it all at once like a real stroke, because that forces you to decelerate, stabilize, and then re-accelerate. So if you can do that and control that movement, that's going to allow you, when you're actually hitting, to release so much better, because you're able to store and release your energy so much more efficiently. So here's a series then. If we're using the medicine ball example, notice here how we're going deep. Notice how this is, instead of pausing, you're going deep and you're getting a big hip and shoulder turn and then releasing it, flinging it hard and fast. And again, different drills with the medicine ball for different purposes. Different athletes have different game styles and what we're trying to work on and what they need to get better at. However, using common language when we're communicating with our athlete, with our coaching staff, with our physical trainers, is so important to have everyone on the same page. So wanted to show you a series of drills that can work on some of those things, but having the language correct is so important. For example here, the mogul step. This is directly from the information in this workbook. Is, you see it on this scenario when they get out wide here. So this was a pivot step to go in off the split there. And then on that outside leg, you get those angles. So the shin angle, the knee angle, the ankle position, all on that outside leg is so important. Great athletes will do this position naturally. You don't want to overcoach this, but you do want to understand this position. This position really makes the difference in great tennis movers, good tennis movers, and average tennis movers. Everyone says we got to get in and out of the corners quicker. We get stuck in the corners. We don't have any strength when we have to hit a wide ball. We're off balance. That's all because of lack of stability and lack of strength through this position right here. So training the mogul step is so important, and understanding how to train it is the big factor. We've got to get that lateral stability, lateral power, because a lot of this is coming out. Going in is one thing, that's deceleration, being able to decelerate into the corner, but then re-accelerating out requires strength and realistically power. Ground forces, so how much force can you put into the ground as quickly as possible is the definition of power in this example. And so that right leg is decelerating you. The left leg is actually re-accelerating. Look here. Right leg decelerates, left leg re-accelerates. So really important to recognize that from that perspective. So do you know your positions? Do you know where to load? Do you know the important situations and the joint angles that it should be? So again, go to that resource. It'll give you all these in picture format exactly like this. So you can see the step counts. You can see where the positions are. Here, again, Novak doing the same situation right there. So again, it's very standard position. The best players do this better than just about everyone else. So here we've got the recovery step. So right on here, notice you're going here. This is a bit different because you're hitting, recovering inside the court. So again, the goal here is to get your angles right and then to go straight into that front crossover on the recovery. The goal on this one isn't the same as the previous two. The previous two, you had less time pressure, meaning that the athlete was being stretched pretty much to their limit. Here, the athlete's not being stretched to their limit. They're in more of an offensive position. They're looking to take this ball as a winner down the line or to hit it really hard, either down the line or cross court, to set themselves up for either a volley if they move forward or a real easy next shot. But the goal here and what we were working on was specifically loading and getting back fast. So hit and recover. Notice how well this is done from a standpoint of the recovery. Landing on that right leg, turning that hip in as it comes back. And notice how fast that movement is done. And that's training. I mean, known Maddie and worked with Maddie since she was 12 years old. And she's worked on that for years, trying to continually get better at that position. Because especially with players that have power games, meaning they hit the ball harder than just about everyone else they play, they sometimes forget about footwork because they don't need it as much because they're in better positions and they can out-hit a lot of players. But as we know, as you get closer to the pinnacle of your sport, everyone moves well, everyone hits the ball really hard, and that margin for error goes away. You have to be really good at just about everything nowadays. Here is a similar type training move with a heavier med ball, working on that outside leg and that front crossover. So you want to work on that position, getting out there, loading, and pushing hard. It's really, really important to get these positions down, because if you don't get these positions down, so what we're trying to do here, again, this off-court drill is working on split, getting a little bit of power into those legs, and then turn and go. And again, there's a lot of different ways to train these movements, but hopefully today the goal is to just think about, what are you calling this movement? This is a standard front crossover. I think most people are familiar with this. So I wanted to use movements that pretty much everyone, I hope, is in agreement with and how you're terming these positions. It's some of the other positions that people use different terms for. So from a combine standpoint, one of the things we want to talk about here is making sure that you know how to test. As we say, testing is vital. So with what we do, we want to have benchmarks for everything. We want to know how fast your athlete is, how do they compare to someone their age, how do they compare to someone 2 years older than them, how do they compare to someone who's playing at the collegiate level, how do they compare to the best at the ITF junior level, how do they compare to someone at the pro level. Because if you're not in the top tier on most physical tests, you're not going to make it at the highest levels, which is fine. You've got to know where your athletes are and then what areas you got to work on. So we use the Tennis Fitness Combine. There's a lot of different fitness tests out there. This came about because with some of our athletes, we have access to some technology and hardware and different types of things that are more complicated and more complex to test athletes. But coaches around the country and around the world, many of them don't have a lot of resources. So what we tried to do was come out with a fitness combine that could be used at clubs around the world easily with low cost, meaning it's less than $50 for all the equipment you would need. So you don't need to spend any real money. You need a medicine ball, you need a tape measure, you need a stopwatch or watch on your phone, and that's really all. As long as you've got a tennis court or access to a space big enough to do some of these movements. So very low cost. It's called the Tennis Fitness Combine. You can look at it at the Kovacs Institute. This is some of the stuff we do. There's a discount code if you use KI blog for anyone that's involved in this conference. But again, the goal here is to test speed, agility, tennis-specific endurance, power, all the things we know we need from a tennis standpoint. The beauty of this, though, is we have normative data. meaning we have data from over nearly 40 years now, and the best players in the world were tested on these. So a lot of these tests have 40 plus years of data. They may not be the greatest test in the world, but the beauty of it is we know what good looks like, and we can compare athletes. So again, some of them are very tennis specific, like the service box touch test. Some of them are not that specific. It's a 20-yard sprint. But they all have normative data, and you can tell if your athlete is at the level that they want to play or if they've got a lot of areas for improvement. Strength testing, make sure you're doing consistent strength testing. If you're a strength and conditioning coach, physical trainer, doing hex bar deadlift or trap bar deadlift, for example, is one of the most common strength tests that we should do. One, the reason is it's really safe if you know how to teach it. You can lift heavy, and you can easily go up in weight and monitor it. We use the broad jump a lot for lower body power because it gives us a sense of how explosive is this athlete. And we test and monitor consistently to make sure that we're seeing improvement. Because if we're not seeing improvement, then we shouldn't be training the way we're training. We're not getting better. Single leg movements are really important, as we know for tennis. We do both lateral movements and linear jumps, meaning that you'll do them both ways, because you want, like this, you want to see how the athlete's able to rotate on that leg, how much power they have in a lateral perspective. So again, we want to see what this looks like here, and do they have the ability to move and jump and explode in those positions that we may need on the tennis court. Got to also work on your technique. It's not just about getting stronger, it's about getting the right technique off court, so that when the coach is working with them on court, they can just focus on, trying to hit the ball better, try to get in and out of the corners quicker, and just become a better overall tennis player, which is the goal. Off-court training needs to support and supplement the on-court training, not the other way around. This is one we utilize a lot with our tennis players, and really anyone that's trying to improve lateral explosiveness, because what we're doing here is we're overloading the eccentric part, or the down part, the storing of energy, and then we're releasing the weight and then jumping in a lightened environment, which will allow us to generate a quicker movement pattern, and that neurologically trains the signal from the brain to the leg to fire in a slightly different way. So we've got a great opportunity to improve that lateral movement if we're training in the gym the right way. Do a lot of work training for stability in and out of the corners. Notice where the foot is. Notice where the toe is. We do a lot of this. We can do it with or without shoes. We'll do a lot of this without shoes. One for big toe strength, big toe range of motion. But the goal here is to get stability in that. Notice how that position is that last foot ground contact before your foot would come off in a front crossover recovery. So we want to get really strong and stable right in there. Again, a lot of different ways to train this, but you have to understand, what are we trying to work on? Is it tennis specific? Are we making our athlete better? From a functional or range-based strength standpoint, we had the hex bar deadlift. That was used for general strength. This is used for a little bit more lateral specific strength, and we don't have to load it up that heavy, but we have to get low and get in those positions that we know the athlete's going to need. General strength, again, nothing wrong with general strength. We use it a lot. We just got to combine it with very important tennis specific strength as well. Mobility, I think everyone knows the importance of mobility around footwork and movement, so make sure that you don't let that go. We got to get the hips loosened up. We got to have great internal hip rotation. It's one of the tightest areas on a tennis player, is internal hip rotation. We've got to work on that as much as possible. And then program design. We don't have enough time today to go into specific program design discussions. That's a whole presentation in itself. But in general, we have a very defined way of setting up your workouts based on how the body responds physiologically. You want to warm up, obviously, and then you want to go into your speed and power type movements to be highly explosive. And you usually want to work on that before your tennis practice, because you got to get those fast twitch fibers, the signal from the brain to the muscle, firing when the athlete is the freshest. If you're doing what you call movement training or speed training at the end of practice, there's nothing wrong with that. Just understand that's not making the athlete faster. It may work on technique when they're fatigued, which is valuable. It may work on some tennis-specific endurance in short movements that you may think you're doing speed activities because the drill's possibly a speed drill, but the athlete's fatigued, so you're not getting them faster. They need to be fresh to truly get faster. So, not saying you should never do these type of movements at the end of practice, but if you do them at the end, understand what you are training and what you're not training. Two different things. So, again, hopefully this is helpful. If you want more information, if you go to our website here, use the term KI blog, you'll get a 15% discount here through the end of May. So, again, excited to be part of this. Thanks so much to the organizers. Please go to the ITPA-tennis.org website if you're looking for physical training. There's a lot of information there, a lot of great education, the TPT and the CTPS education programs. So look forward to keeping in contact. Reach out anytime if I can ever be of assistance. And thanks again.